June 1941. Eastern Front. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Within days, the Red Army was in chaos. Soldiers were retreating. Entire units were being surrounded. The German war machine was unstoppable. But then, something unusual happened. The Soviet Union formed something nobody had ever seen before. All-female aviation regiments. Women pilots, women bombardiers, flying into combat. One regiment became legendary, the Night Witches. Per Soviet military records from 1942, these women flew wooden biplanes that were so slow, so vulnerable, that German pilots called them easy targets. Easy targets, but these women refused to die. They flew missions every night, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 missions in a single night. They fought against Messerschmitts, against Focke-Wulfs, against fighters that were 5 times faster. 5 times. Against overwhelming odds, these women became one of the most feared bombing units on the Eastern Front. But survival came at a cost. Many Night Witches didn't make it home. Some were captured, some were shot down, some disappeared into the Russian winter and were never found again. This is their story, a story of courage that changed the course of the war, a story of women who proved that gender didn't determine skill, a story of survival against impossible odds. Stick around because by the end of this video, you'll understand how these women became legends, how they survived when everything was stacked against them, how they changed the Eastern Front. The story of the Night Witches began before the war. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union had a surprising relationship with women pilots. They encouraged them, supported them. Women were flying across the Soviet Union, setting records, proving they could fly as well as men. Per Soviet aviation records from the 1930s, Valentina Grisodubova and other female pilots were celebrated heroes. They were breaking world records, while men in other countries doubted women belonged in aircraft. One woman stood out above the rest, Marina Raskova. Raskova was a navigator, an exceptional navigator. In 1938, she flew across the Soviet Union, setting distance records. She became famous. She was celebrated. She was respected. Then, the war came. When Germany invaded in June 1941, everything changed. The Soviet military was desperate, desperate for pilots, desperate for bombers, desperate for anything that could fight back against the German invasion. Marina Raskova saw an opportunity. She petitioned Stalin directly. She asked for permission to form all-female aviation regiments. Per Soviet war archives, Stalin approved Raskova's request in October 1941. 3 all-female aviation regiments were formed. 3 regiments: fighter pilots, dive bombers, night bombers. The night bomber regiment was the most unusual. It was led by Yevdokia Bershanskaya. Bershanskaya was a veteran pilot with military experience. She was tough. She didn't accept excuses. She didn't tolerate failures. But she also cared deeply for her pilots. She trained them relentlessly. She pushed them to their limits. She taught them how to survive against the odds. The regiment was given aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2. Per Soviet aircraft specifications, the Po-2 had a maximum speed of 140 kilometers per hour. It was made of wood and canvas. It had no armor, no protective equipment. It was vulnerable in every way. 140 kilometers per hour. For comparison, German Messerschmitts could fly 600 kilometers per hour, 4 times faster. The Po-2 was a training aircraft. It was never designed for combat, but it was what the Soviets had, so the women trained on it. They learned to fly it. They learned to bomb with it. They learned to survive with it. The pilots who joined the regiment were young. Many were in their late teens. Some were in their early 20s. They came from all over the Soviet Union. Factory workers, school teachers, students, women who wanted to fight, women who wanted to defend their homeland. By early 1942, the regiment was ready. The women had completed their training. They were transferred to the front lines. They began flying combat missions. The first missions were terrifying. The women flew at night. That was the strategy. German fighters couldn't easily hunt in darkness, so the night witches would fly at night. They would fly low, very low, sometimes just 50 meters above the ground. They would fly toward German positions, German trenches, German supply lines, German airfields. When they got close, they would drop their bombs. Small bombs. The Po-2 could only carry a few hundred pounds, not enough to destroy buildings, but enough to cause disruption, enough to create fear. Per Soviet combat records, the night witches flew dozens of missions each night. Sometimes one pilot would fly 20 missions in a single night. 20 missions, flying the same route over and over, each time risking death, each time hoping the Germans wouldn't be ready. The tactic was simple, but dangerous. Fly to the target, drop bombs, fly home. But nothing was simple about flying a wooden biplane over German territory. The Germans quickly learned. They learned when the night witches were coming. They would light up the sky with searchlights. They would send up fighters. But the Po-2 had an advantage the Germans didn't expect. It was so slow that German fighters would overshoot it. A Messerschmitt pilot chasing a Po-2 would be going too fast. He would dive past the slow biplane. The Po-2 would bank hard. The Messerschmitt couldn't match that turn. The Po-2 would be behind the Messerschmitt. The German fighter would have to climb and turn around, but by then the Po-2 was gone. The Soviet pilot would slip away into the darkness. The Po-2's slowness was its greatest protection. But protection only went so far. German anti-aircraft guns were everywhere. The women would hear them, the sound of machine gun fire, the tracers coming up from the ground, red and yellow streaks lighting up the night. Sometimes the bullets would hit, the wooden aircraft would splinter, canvas would tear, the Po-2 would lose altitude. Sometimes the pilots could nurse the damaged aircraft home, sometimes they couldn't. Per Soviet records from 1942 to 1943, night witch pilots faced casualties of approximately 30%. 30% of those who flew the aircraft were killed in action. 30%. Imagine flying an aircraft where 1 in 3 pilots wouldn't come back. Imagine knowing that odds. Imagine doing it anyway. Night after night, mission after mission. The women did. They flew, they fought, they died. One pilot named Irina Sebrova became famous. Sebrova flew the most missions of any night witch. Per Soviet military records, Sebrova completed over 1,000 bombing missions during the war, more than any other female pilot. Over 1,000. 1,000 times flying into German territory, 1,000 times risking death, 1,000 times coming back alive. How did she survive? Skill, experience, luck, and something else, determination. She refused to be killed. She refused to fail. She flew with precision. She flew with purpose. She became a legend among the night witches. Other pilots talked about her. They called her the Flying Grandmother, because even after the war, even as she aged, even with thousands of hours of flight time, she never lost her skill. As the war continued, the night witches faced increasing danger. The Germans adapted. They learned where the women flew. They learned when they flew. They set up defenses specifically designed to stop them. By 1943, flying for the night witches was becoming suicidal. But the women kept flying. The Soviet Union needed them. The front lines needed air support. The infantry needed bombers. So the women flew. One night in 1943, a pilot named Polina Gelman was flying her 20th mission of the night. 20 missions. Her arms were tired. Her eyes were burning. She had been in the air for hours. But she was approaching the target. German trenches near Smolensk. She could see the positions. She could see the searchlights coming on. She could see the tracers starting to come up. Gelman dove toward the target. She dropped her bombs. As she pulled up, a burst of machine gun fire hit her aircraft. The right engine was hit. The propellers stopped turning. Per Soviet combat reports, Gelman's aircraft was damaged beyond repair capability. She was flying on one engine over enemy territory with 20 miles to friendly lines. 20 miles. The Po-2 was barely flying. The damaged engine was dead weight. The aircraft was losing altitude. Gelman had to make a decision. Jump out? Bail out over enemy territory? Hope to avoid capture? Or try to nurse the aircraft home? She chose to fly. She coaxed the damaged aircraft. Foot by foot, meter by meter, the aircraft descended, lower and lower. The ground was coming up. Gelman could see trees, she could see roads, she could see German positions. She was still in enemy territory. The aircraft was losing power. The surviving engine was struggling. Gelman realized she wasn't going to make it home. She was going to crash, so she chose where to crash. She aimed for a dark area, a forest, a place where the Germans might not find her. The aircraft hit the trees. It crashed hard. Canvas tore, wood splintered. The Po-2 came to rest in the forest. Gelman was alive. Her navigator was alive. They were in enemy territory. They were miles from Soviet lines. Per Soviet records, Gelman and her navigator spent 3 days walking through German territory. They avoided German patrols. They navigated by the stars. They found their way back to Soviet lines. 3 days, walking through snow, cold, hungry, hunted. But they made it. They returned to the regiment. Gelman went back to flying. This was the pattern for many night witches. Crash, survive, return, fly again. Another pilot named Raya Sernachkova had a different story. Sernachkova was captured by the Germans. Her aircraft was shot down. She was captured alive. Per documented accounts from Soviet veterans, Sernachkova was a prisoner of war at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She was treated terribly. She was starved. She was beaten. But she survived. Survived the camps. Survived the war. Survived to tell her story. The night witches became symbols of Soviet resistance. They were feared by the Germans. The Germans gave them a nickname, Nachthexen, night witches, not because they were scary, but because they seemed impossible to kill. Night after night, mission after mission, they would come back for more. By 1944, the night witches had flown over 20,000 bombing missions. Per Soviet military statistics, the regiment had conducted 23,626 combat sorties by the end of the war. That's more bombing missions than any other unit of similar size in the war. 23,000 in wooden biplanes against one of the most powerful air forces in the world. The night witches were proving something profound. They were proving that gender didn't determine courage, that training and determination could overcome any obstacle, that women could fight just as well as men. As 1945 approached, the war was changing. The Soviet army was advancing, pushing west across Eastern Europe. The Germans were retreating, but the fighting was still fierce. The night witches continued flying. They flew support missions for the advancing Soviet army. They bombed German positions ahead of the infantry. They hit supply lines. They harassed German forces. Per Soviet military records, by 1945, the night witches had suffered over 30% casualties. Over 30 members of the regiment had been killed in action. Over 30 deaths in a regiment of just over 100 pilots. That was a devastating casualty rate. But the women kept flying. In the final months of the war, the regiment achieved something remarkable. They were awarded the status of Guards, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. Per Soviet military honors, the Guards designation was the highest recognition. It meant the regiment had earned the respect and gratitude of the Soviet military. Guard status. It meant their sacrifices were recognized. It meant they were heroes. Irina Sebrova, the pilot who flew over 1,000 missions, was decorated multiple times. She received medals. She received honors. she became a celebrated war hero. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the commander who had trained them, was also recognized. She survived the war. She continued her military career. She became a general. But victory came with bittersweet feelings. The pilots who survived lost friends. They had seen women die, women they had trained with, women they had flown with, women who had sacrificed everything for the Soviet Union. When the war ended in May 1945, the Night Witches were heroes. The Soviet people celebrated them. But something unexpected happened. After the war, the Soviet Union didn't celebrate women in combat the same way. Women pilots were dismissed from the Air Force. They were told their services were no longer needed. Many had to find civilian jobs. Per Soviet historical records, many Night Witches faced difficulty after the war. Some struggled with what they had experienced. Some faced discrimination. Some died in poverty despite their heroic service. The recognition they had earned in wartime didn't protect them in peace. Irina Sebrova worked as a test pilot after the war. She continued flying, but she was never given the same status as male pilots. She eventually retired and lived quietly. Some Night Witches became teachers. Some became engineers. Some simply tried to forget what they had experienced. It took decades for the Night Witches to be properly honored. In the 1980s and beyond, historians and researchers began documenting their stories. They interviewed the surviving pilots. They collected their accounts. They told the world about the women who had flown into impossible odds. Today, the Night Witches are remembered. They are celebrated in Russia. They are honored internationally. They are recognized as heroes. But for many years after the war, they were forgotten. Their sacrifices were minimized. Their achievements were downplayed. It's a reminder that heroism doesn't always receive immediate recognition. It's a reminder that women's contributions to history are often overlooked. It's a reminder that we must actively seek out and celebrate the forgotten heroes. The Night Witches proved something that historians sometimes forget. They proved that women are capable of the same courage as men, the same sacrifice, the same heroism. The Night Witches flew 23,626 combat missions in wooden biplanes against one of the world's most advanced air forces. They suffered 30% casualties, and they never quit. They never quit. That's the legacy. That's what makes them matter. If you found this story powerful, hit the like button. It tells us you want more forgotten WWII heroes. Subscribe. We release incredible true stories of WWII survival every week. In the comments, tell me, what's the most incredible survival story you know of? Let's discuss. Next video, The Pilot Who Flew with a Broken Back, a story of pain and determination. Thank you for watching. Remember, the Night Witches remind us that courage doesn't see gender, that determination can overcome any obstacle, that the greatest acts of heroism often come from the most unlikely people. That's why their story matters. See you next time.